At our divorce hearing, my husband smirked and said, "Get comfortable being homeless because you're getting nothing." The courtroom actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough for me to feel it crawl across my skin like heat. I didn't argue. I didn't cry either. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited while my husband leaned back beside his attorney, with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already destroyed someone. But right before the judge closed the case, my lawyer slowly stood up and said, "Your Honor, there's one undisclosed account left." Then she read the balance aloud. And for the first time in 15 years, my husband looked afraid. Part 1, the woman he thought he owned. People think emotional abuse always sounds loud, screaming, broken dishes, bruises hidden beneath sweaters, but in my experience, the cruelest kind arrives dressed in ordinary moments. It lives inside small humiliations, inside private dismissals, inside years of being treated like furniture someone once loved enough to buy, but no longer notices standing in the room. My husband, Daniel Mercer, never raised a hand to me. He never had to. By the end of our marriage, he could wound me with a smile. We lived in Neepville, Illinois, in one of those expensive neighborhoods where every lawn looked professionally trimmed and every family pretended their life was cleaner than it really was. Daniel loved that neighborhood. He loved appearances in general luxury SUVs, golf memberships, charity galas, imported wine he could barely pronounce correctly. From the outside, he looked successful, dependable, charming, and to be fair, he was successful. Daniel worked in commercial real estate development, and by 47, he'd built a reputation as a man who could close almost any deal in Chicago's western suburbs. He knew how to flatter investors, how to shake hands firmly, how to walk into a room and make people feel temporarily important. Men admired him. Women noticed him. Waiters remembered his name. At parties, he liked resting his hand on my back while introducing me. "This is my wife, Claire," he'd say warmly. "She keeps my life together." People always smiled at me after that. What they didn't understand was that Daniel only praised me publicly because privately he wanted me smaller. Smaller ambitions, smaller voice, smaller confidence. Over time, he made sure of it carefully enough that I almost didn't notice it happening. When we first married, I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. I loved the work spreadsheets, forecasting investment structures, long-term planning. I liked solving problems quietly, while people took credit for them afterward. But after our daughter Sophie was born, Daniel convinced me stepping back from my career temporarily made more sense financially. "You're stressed all the time," he told me. "Then, why kill yourself working when I'm already making enough for both of us?" At the time, it sounded loving, reasonable even. I believed him because back then, I still believed we were building something together, but temporary became permanent faster than I expected. 1 year turned into 5, then 10. Meanwhile, Daniel's career exploded upward, while mine slowly disappeared into school pickups, grocery lists, orthodontist appointments, and organizing charity auctions for people wealthier than we were pretending to be. At first, he thanked me for sacrificing my career. Later, he joked about it. Then, eventually, he used it against me. "You wouldn't survive corporate life anymore," he once said casually while scrolling through emails at dinner. "You've been out too long." Another time, after I questioned one of his reckless investments, he laughed softly and muttered, "That's cute. Cute." I remember staring at him across the kitchen island, wondering how a man could make a woman feel invisible, using only one word. The older Sophie got, the worse Daniel became. Not publicly, never publicly. He was too intelligent for obvious cruelty. Snorts instead, he specialized in erosion. Tiny cuts repeated over years until your confidence bleeds out quietly. If I bought something expensive for myself, he noticed immediately. Must be nice spending money you didn't earn. If I disagreed with him at dinner parties, he corrected me with that patient, humiliating tone people use with children. And whenever we argued privately, he always returned to the same point eventually. "I'm the reason this family has a life." By then, I had stopped fighting back. Not because he was right, because I was tired. That's the part people rarely understand about long marriages that die slowly. Exhaustion becomes its own prison. You stop imagining escape, because surviving the day already consumes all your emotional energy. Still, somewhere deep inside me, a quiet resentment had begun hardening into something colder. I think Daniel sensed it. Men like him always do. About 8 months before the divorce, he started coming home later. His phone remained glued to his hand, constantly screen tilted away whenever I entered the room. He became oddly protective of his gym schedule, his work dinners, his networking events. One Friday night, Sophie looked up from the kitchen table while finishing homework and asked innocently, "Why does Dad smile at his phone more than he smiles at us?" Daniel wasn't home when she said it. I remember freezing beside the sink because children have a way of saying devastating truths without realizing they've done it. I wanted to defend him. Instead, I changed the subject. The affair itself wasn't difficult to discover. People always imagine cheating requires detective work, but most affairs are uncovered through arrogance, not intelligence. Daniel had grown careless because he genuinely believed I would never leave him. I found the receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry dinner for two at a rooftop restaurant downtown. Nearly $400 spent on wine alone. The date on the receipt matched a night he'd told me he was meeting investors. I should have confronted him immediately. Instead, I waited. 3 days later, while Daniel showered upstairs, his second phone buzzed inside his briefcase. I still remember the message glowing on the screen. "I miss you already. Last night felt like freedom. No name, just a heart emoji." And suddenly, 15 years of marriage rearranged themselves inside my mind with horrifying clarity. All the late meetings, the emotional distance, the irritation whenever I entered a room, the way he'd stopped looking at me unless he needed something. Oddly enough, I didn't cry. Not then. I simply sat there at the kitchen counter, while rain tapped softly against the windows. And for the first time in years, I felt absolutely calm. Not because my marriage was ending, because I finally understood it already had. Daniel came downstairs 20 minutes later, wearing one of his expensive gray suits, adjusting his cufflinks while speaking into a Bluetooth headset. He snorts barely looked at me while pouring coffee. And in that moment, watching this man move confidently through a life I had helped build for him, I realized something that changed everything afterward. Daniel believed I needed him far more than he needed me. That belief would eventually destroy him, but at the time he still thought he owned me. The strange thing about betrayal is that it sharpens your vision. For years I had moved through my marriage, like someone slowly adjusting to darkness, telling myself I could still see clearly, even while tripping over things that should have been obvious. But after discovering Daniel's affair, something inside me became painfully awake. I noticed every interruption, every condescending smile, every calculated silence he used to keep control of a room, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. For nearly 2 weeks, I said nothing about the second phone, nothing about the restaurant receipt, nothing about the woman sending messages after midnight while I lay beside her husband pretending to sleep. Instead, I watched him. That was what unsettled me most in retrospect. How easy it became to detach emotionally once the illusion finally collapsed. I still cooked dinner, still asked about Sophie's school schedule, still sat beside him during one painfully awkward charity fundraiser where Daniel spent half the evening texting beneath the tablecloth while pretending to listen to a pediatric cancer donor speak. But internally, something had changed permanently. I stopped trying to save him in my mind, and once you stop protecting someone emotionally, you begin seeing them exactly as they are. 3 weeks after I found the phone, Daniel finally decided to initiate the divorce himself. Not because he felt guilty, because he felt entitled. I came downstairs one Tuesday morning and found him standing in the kitchen wearing a navy suit, sipping coffee with the detached confidence of a man rehearsing a business transaction. "We should separate," he said flatly, no hesitation, no visible emotion, not even enough respect to sit down first. For a moment, I simply stared at him while the coffee machine hummed softly between us. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Is there someone else?" Daniel didn't answer immediately, which told me everything. Finally, he exhaled impatiently and said, "This marriage hasn't worked in years, Claire. That wasn't denial, that was strategy. People rewrite history when they want permission to behave badly. Suddenly, every sacrifice becomes irrelevant because acknowledging love would force them to confront their own cruelty. I nodded once and said quietly, "If you want a divorce, then file for one." His expression shifted slightly, then almost confusion. I think he expected tears, begging, anger. Instead, I walked upstairs calmly and closed the bedroom door behind me. That was the first moment Daniel realized something about me had become unfamiliar. The divorce papers arrived 11 days later. Aggressive, cold, designed to intimidate. Daniel wanted the house sold immediately. Claimed snorts the majority of our marital assets stemmed directly from his income, and argued that my long absence from the workforce made substantial spousal support financially unreasonable. Snorts. His attorney used polished legal language to imply I had contributed very little beyond domestic maintenance. Domestic maintenance, 15 years of supporting his career, reduced to wording that sounded like building repairs. Sophie cried when she learned about the divorce, though she tried hiding it. She snorts was 16 by then, old enough to understand what affairs meant. Old enough to recognize dishonesty, even when adults avoided naming it directly. "What happened to you guys?" she asked me quietly one night. I could have destroyed him then. Could have told her everything. Instead, I said the only truthful thing that mattered. Your father stopped valuing what he already had. Even now, I'm proud I said it that way. Children should never become weapons in adult wars. Daniel moved out less than a month later into a luxury apartment in downtown Chicago. 2 weeks after that, Sophie accidentally discovered photos online of him attending a charity gala with another woman, Vanessa Hale, 32 years old, a marketing consultant with glossy hair, expensive cheekbones, and the polished confidence of someone accustomed to being admired in restaurants. The internet can be crueler than any courtroom. By the following week, half our social circle already knew. Some women called me sympathetically, others called because they were curious. There's a difference. One afternoon, my friend Denise sat across from me at a coffee shop and finally asked the question everyone else avoided. "How are you this calm?" I looked out the window for several seconds before answering. "Because this isn't the worst thing that happened," I said quietly. She frowned. "What do you mean?" The worst thing, I told her, was spending years believing I deserved it. Denise went silent after that, and honestly, so did I. Because somewhere beneath the humiliation and grief, another emotion had begun quietly emerging: clarity. Daniel believed I was weak because he had mistaken kindness for dependence. That was his fatal error. The truth was far more complicated. Long before I met Daniel, my grandfather had taught me something most people never fully understand about money. Wealth whispers while insecurity performs. My grandfather, Arthur Bennett, spent 40 years buying neglected commercial land throughout Illinois and Indiana during the 70s and 80s, long before suburban expansion transformed those properties into valuable developments. He lived modestly despite being extraordinarily wealthy, drove old Buicks until they nearly died, and distrusted flashy people instinctively. Daniel always found him boring. That amused my grandfather endlessly. "He talks too much," Grandpa once told me after meeting Daniel for dinner. "Men who need everyone impressed usually owe somebody money." At the time, I defended my husband. I wish I hadn't. When my grandfather passed away 6 years into my marriage, he left me something Daniel barely paid attention to, because it didn't look glamorous. A protected investment trust managed quietly through an old Chicago financial firm. The trust contained diversified holdings, commercial property revenue, municipal bonds, and minority equity positions accumulated over decades. It wasn't billionaire money, but it was substantial enough that if managed properly, neither Sophie nor I would ever struggle financially. Daniel knew the trust existed in vague terms, but he dismissed it immediately because he assumed anything inherited by me must be minor compared to his own earnings. Over the years, he never once asked detailed questions about it, never reviewed statements, never attended meetings with attorneys or financial advisors. He simply assumed I was financially irrelevant. And because the trust remained legally separate, property never commingled with marital assets. It belonged entirely to me. Ironically, my financial background had never disappeared either. While Daniel spent years obsessing over appearances, I quietly continued managing investments, reinvesting distributions, and building long-term positions through private brokerage accounts under legal advisement. Nothing hidden illegally, nothing deceptive, just disciplined financial stewardship performed so quietly, my own husband never cared enough to notice. By the time Daniel filed for divorce, the total value of my separate assets had surpassed $8 million. I never told him, not because I intended revenge, because I never imagined I would need protection from my own husband. The turning point came during my second meeting with my attorney, Rebecca Stein. Rebecca was in her early 50s, composed in the terrifying way only highly intelligent women become. After spending decades watching arrogant men underestimate them professionally, she read through Daniel's filings carefully, then removed her glasses and asked, "Did your husband ever request formal discovery regarding your separate holdings number?" She leaned back slowly. "That's interesting." I frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because he's behaving like a man convinced you have nothing," she said calmly. "And people who feel invincible usually make mistakes." Then she tapped one particular document Daniel submitted. He also underreported several business transfers here. I stared at her. "You think he's hiding money?" Rebecca gave a thin smile. "Oh, Claire," she said softly, "I think your husband's biggest problem is that he believes he's the smartest person in every room for the first time since the divorce began." I smiled too. Divorce, at least in America, is rarely about love. By the time lawyers become involved, it becomes accounting, narratives, control. People sitting across polished conference tables, trying to assign numerical value to years of emotional damage no spreadsheet could accurately measure. And Daniel approached our divorce the same way he approached business negotiations: aggressively, strategically, and with absolute confidence that intimidation would eventually force surrender. What he didn't understand was that fear loses power once someone has already accepted the collapse of their old life. By the beginning of winter, our marriage had become paperwork. Depositions, financial disclosures, mediation scheduling, asset evaluations, endless attorney emails arriving at all hours carrying language that sounded emotionally neutral while quietly reshaping entire futures. Rebecca warned me early not to expect dignity from the process. Family court reveals character faster than almost anything, she told me one afternoon after mediation failed for the second time. People become who they really are when money and ego collide. She was right. Daniel transformed quickly. At first, his cruelty remained subtle enough that outsiders might have missed it. He delayed document submissions, intentionally ignored deadlines, questioned routine expenses connected to Sophie, and repeatedly implied through his attorney that I was exaggerating my financial needs after years of voluntary unemployment. Voluntary unemployment, another phrase designed to erase sacrifice. Rebecca handled most of it professionally, but occasionally even she lost patience. "He keeps framing you like some dependent ex-girlfriend instead of the woman who helped build his entire adult life," she muttered once after reviewing another filing. The irony was painful because, financially, I needed nothing from Daniel at all. But Rebecca insisted on handling the divorce correctly. "This isn't about whether you can survive without him," she said firmly. Snorts, "It's about legal fairness. Don't let pride help him rewrite history." Meanwhile, Daniel's relationship with Vanessa became increasingly public. They attended restaurants openly, now posted filtered rooftop photos online, traveled to Scottsdale for New Year's, while Sophie spent Christmas pretending not to notice her father barely called. Vanessa herself never contacted me directly, but there's a certain type of woman who communicates through performance: carefully staged photos, visible jewelry captions about new beginnings, strategically posted before court dates. 3. At first, those things hurt. Then eventually, they embarrassed me on Daniel's behalf, because there is something profoundly undignified about middle-aged men performing youth for validation. The social fallout spread gradually through our community. Some friends disappeared quietly because divorce makes people uncomfortable. Unhappy marriages prefer avoiding mirrors. Others chose sides in ways so transparent it almost became funny. Couples Daniel golfed, with suddenly stopped inviting me to dinners. Women who once praised my parenting now looked vaguely relieved it wasn't happening to them. But a few people surprised me. Our neighbor, Mr. Meadle Delaney, began shoveling my driveway before sunrise after heavy snowstorms, without ever mentioning the divorce directly. Sophie's piano teacher started extending lessons an extra 15 minutes because she sensed Sophie needed somewhere peaceful to breathe. Denise showed up twice with groceries, despite my repeated insistence that I was financially fine. Kindness becomes unforgettable once your life fractures. Sophie struggled the most quietly. Teenagers rarely express heartbreak directly. Snorts. Instead, it leaked sideways into changed behavior. She stopped speaking about college tours enthusiastically, started wearing headphones constantly around the house. One night, I found her sitting alone in the dark living room, staring at old family photos on her phone. "He acts happier now," she whispered without looking at me. The sadness in her voice nearly broke me. I sat beside her slowly. "Sometimes people confuse freedom with happiness," I said carefully. She turned toward me, then eyes red. "Did Dad stop loving us?" There are questions children ask that no parent can answer honestly without causing damage. I chose my words slowly. "I think your father stopped appreciating us." I said, "That's different." She nodded, though I wasn't sure she believed me. Truthfully, part of me didn't either. The ugliest moment came during mediation in February. Daniel arrived late, wearing an expensive charcoal coat, and that familiar expression of controlled superiority he used whenever he believed someone else lacked leverage. Vanessa wasn't present physically, but I noticed her texting him repeatedly throughout the session. Rebecca noticed too. During negotiations, Daniel proposed selling the house immediately and limiting long-term support almost entirely. Betty, his attorney, Richard Coleman, framed the proposal with polished corporate language about reasonable financial transition. Then Daniel looked directly at me and said, "You wanted independence, Claire. This is what it looks like." I remember Rebecca going completely still beside me, not angry, dangerously calm. "What exactly do you believe Mrs. Mercer contributed during this marriage?" she asked evenly. Daniel gave a dismissive shrug. "She raised Sophie, managed the house. The usual. The usual." 15 years compressed into 2 words. I should have felt humiliated. Instead, for the first time, I felt something colder. Pity. Because sitting across that conference table, watching Daniel reduce our life together into transactional categories, I suddenly realized he genuinely didn't understand intimacy at all. To him, value only existed if publicly measurable salary, title, status, admiration. Emotional labor remained invisible, because he had consumed it his entire life without ever learning its cost. That realization changed something important inside me. I stopped wanting him back entirely, not emotionally, not morally, not even nostalgically. And once that happened, the divorce stopped feeling like destruction. It started feeling like release. A week later, Rebecca uncovered the first serious inconsistency in Daniel's disclosures. Several commercial transfers connected to one of his development partnerships had been moved through a secondary LLC shortly before filing for divorce. Illegally, the maneuver wasn't necessarily criminal, but the timing looked suspicious enough that Rebecca immediately requested additional records. Daniel resisted aggressively, which told us everything. "He's hiding exposure," Rebecca said, after reviewing the responses. "Maybe debt, maybe undeclared income, maybe asset shielding. Either way, panic makes people sloppy." For the first time since proceedings began, Daniel started losing emotional control. His emails became sharper. His tone during co-parenting calls became openly hostile. Once, after Sophie mentioned wanting me present during a college visit, instead of him, he exploded over speakerphone. "You've poisoned her against me," he snapped. I almost laughed. Men like Daniel always believe consequences are conspiracies. Near the end of March, we attended a pre-trial conference downtown. The hearing itself was procedural and relatively brief. But afterward, while lawyers gathered documents near the hallway elevators, Daniel stepped beside me quietly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled faintly and said, "You know what your problem is, Claire?" I looked at him calmly. You still think dignity matters." His tone wasn't cruel. Exactly. Worse, dismissive, as though kindness itself were evidence of weakness. Then his eyes drifted over my coat, my shoes, my tired face. "After this is over," he said softly, "you'll be lucky if someone lets you sleep on their couch." And there it was. The full truth beneath 15 years of marriage. Not love damaged by circumstance. Contempt hidden beneath comfort. I didn't respond. I simply held his gaze long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel looked uncertain around me. Only briefly, but I saw it because deep down, somewhere beneath the arrogance and performance, he had started sensing something dangerous. I was no longer afraid of him. That terrified him more than losing money ever could. The morning of our divorce hearing arrived gray and bitterly cold. The kind of Chicago, spring day that looked like winter refusing to surrender gracefully. I woke before sunrise and stood alone in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes without turning on the lights. Sophie was still asleep upstairs, though I knew she hadn't rested much the night before. Neither had I. Not because I feared losing the case, because endings, even necessary ones, carry their own grief. 15 years is a long time to untangle emotionally. Long enough for habits to become architecture. Long enough for someone's voice to live permanently inside your nervous system. Even after everything Daniel had done, part of me still mourned the version of us that once existed before ego, resentment, and betrayal hollowed him out from the inside. That was the hardest truth of divorce. Sometimes you grieve the person long before they actually leave. By 8:30 that morning, Rebecca and I were seated inside the DuPage County Courthouse, reviewing final notes, while attorneys moved briskly through the hallways, carrying folders and coffee cups, like exhausted soldiers. The courtroom itself was smaller than television dramas. Make them seem fluorescent lighting, worn carpeting, heavy silence interrupted occasionally by shuffling papers, and distant doors closing somewhere down the corridor. Real life rarely looks cinematic while it's happening. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later. Perfect suit, perfect tie, perfect posture. Vanessa wasn't seated beside him, but I noticed her near the back row almost immediately. She wore a cream-colored coat and the restrained expression of someone trying very hard to appear supportive while secretly enjoying the spectacle. Oddly enough, seeing her there no longer hurt. If anything, I felt embarrassed for her, because women like Vanessa always believe they're witnessing the beginning of something, when in reality they're often just standing near the end of someone else's pattern. Daniel glanced at me once while taking his seat across the aisle. No warmth, no guilt, only confidence. That confidence lasted almost 2 hours. The hearing itself unfolded exactly the way Rebecca predicted. Daniel's attorney spoke first, presenting him as the primary financial contributor throughout the marriage. Successful, stable, generous. Richard Coleman emphasized my long absence from the workforce, repeatedly, carefully shaping language to imply dependency without sounding overtly cruel. Professional humiliation always arrives polished. Then came discussions regarding property division, support calculations, investment disclosures, and custodial logistics concerning Sophie's upcoming college transition. The judge, Harold Whitmore, listened patiently while taking occasional notes, his expression revealing almost nothing. I answered every question calmly. That seemed to frustrate Daniel more than anger would have. Several times, I caught him studying me with subtle confusion, as though he still expected some emotional collapse he could interpret as weakness. But after months of surviving betrayal publicly, something inside me had become extraordinarily still. Not numb, steady. When Rebecca questioned Daniel regarding several undisclosed business transfers, his composure cracked slightly for the first time. "Those transactions were legitimate," he replied sharply. "Then why were they moved 3 weeks before filing for divorce?" Rebecca asked evenly. Richard objected immediately. The judge allowed limited continuation. Daniel shifted in his seat. Small movement, but noticeable. Rebecca never raised her voice once during the hearing. That was part of what made her so effective. She spoke with surgical calm, allowing arrogant people enough space to expose themselves voluntarily. By early afternoon, Judge Whitmore began summarizing preliminary findings. The atmosphere in the courtroom subtly relaxed. Richard Coleman appeared satisfied. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting loosely against the table. Then he made the mistake that ultimately destroyed him. While the judge reviewed housing considerations, Daniel smiled faintly and muttered just loudly enough for me to hear. Get comfortable being homeless. Because you're getting nothing. Not rage, not cruelty performed dramatically, just casual contempt. The kind built through years of believing another person exists beneath you. A few people nearby heard it. Someone behind us gave an awkward laugh. I didn't react. I simply folded my hands together and looked toward the judge. Beside me, Rebecca remained completely expressionless, and for several more minutes Daniel believed he had won. Then, Judge Whitmore closed his folder and began concluding the hearing. That should finalize the outstanding financial disclosures, unless either counsel has additional matters requiring entry into record. Rebecca stood immediately, smoothly, without urgency. Yes, Your Honor, she said calmly. There is one additional account that has not yet been formally addressed. Daniel frowned instantly. Richard looked confused. The judge adjusted his glasses. What account is this, Miss Stein? Rebecca opened a thin folder in front of her. A separate financial account legally belonging to Mrs. Mercer through protected inherited holdings and associated investment structures. She said the account was excluded from marital property considerations because it remains non-commingled under Illinois law. However, opposing counsel repeatedly characterized Mrs. Mercer throughout these proceedings as financially dependent and effectively destitute following dissolution. A silence settled over the courtroom. I watched Daniel's expression carefully. At first he looked irritated, then uncertain, then suddenly alert. Rebecca continued calmly. For clarity of record, the current documented valuation of Mrs. Mercer's separate holdings, including trust distributions and investment accounts, exceeds $8.4 million. The room went completely still. Even now, months later, I can still remember the exact sound that followed. Nothing. No whispers, no dramatic gasps, just silence so complete it almost felt physical. Daniel blinked once, twice, then leaned forward abruptly as though he'd misheard her. What he said, not loudly, just instinctively. Rebecca slid the documentation toward the bench. Judge Whitmore reviewed the pages carefully, while Richard Coleman's face drained of color beside his client. Daniel stared at me now with genuine disbelief. Not anger yet, not humiliation fully formed, but something far more destabilizing: confusion. Because in that moment, the entire story he'd built about our marriage collapsed publicly in front of him. I had never been financially helpless, never trapped, never dependent. I stayed because I loved him, and he had mistaken love for weakness. What exactly is this? Richard asked carefully. Rebecca answered without hesitation. Mrs. Mercer's Anvar established a protected investment trust over 2 decades ago. The assets remained separate property throughout the marriage and appreciated substantially under professional management. Daniel looked physically unsteady now. You knew about this, he demanded suddenly. I met his eyes calmly. You never asked. That hurt him more than the money. I saw it happen in real time. Because Daniel finally understood something unbearable. His arrogance had blinded him so completely. He never even bothered learning who his wife truly was. Judge Whitmore reviewed the records for several long moments before looking directly at Daniel. Mr. Mercer's, he said carefully, this court is considerably less persuaded now by prior implications regarding Mrs. Mercer's financial dependency. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in 15 years, he had absolutely no control over the room. Vanessa quietly stood in the back row. Then, no scene, no tearser. She simply gathered her purse and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Daniel noticed, and somehow that seemed to break something inside him, even further. By the time the hearing adjourned, the energy surrounding him had changed entirely. Not because people envied my money, because everyone present had finally seen the truth beneath his performance. The wealthy, powerful husband, who spent months humiliating his wife publicly, had never actually understood her at all. As people slowly exited the courtroom, Daniel approached me near the aisle. Gone was the smugness, Gone was the superiority. Now he looked pale, smaller somehow. "Claire," he began quietly. I stopped him gently. "I was never broke," I said calmly. "I was loyal." Then I walked away, and for the first time since my marriage began falling apart, I felt free. People imagine revenge feels explosive. They imagine shouting, triumph, dramatic music, playing somewhere in the background while the villain finally collapses beneath the weight of their own cruelty. Real but real revenge, the kind that actually changes your life, is usually much quieter than that. It's waking up one morning and realizing the person who tried to diminish you no longer controls your sense of self. It's peace. And peace terrifies certain people more than rage ever could. The weeks following the hearing spread through our social circles faster than I expected. Wealthy suburban communities survive on gossip disguised as concern. And apparently nothing travels faster than the story of a man humiliating his wife publicly, only to discover she was wealthier than he was the entire time. I hated that part. Not because I felt ashamed, because it reduced something deeply painful into entertainment. Women from charity board suddenly called, asking if I was doing okay in voices carrying unmistakable curiosity beneath the sympathy. Men who barely acknowledged me during my marriage now treated me with awkward respect, as though financial independence had somehow made me more visible overnight. Nate, that bothered me more than I admitted, because my value had not changed. Only their perception of it had. Daniel, meanwhile, began unraveling socially in ways far subtler than public humiliation, but far more damaging long-term. The commercial transfer issues Rebecca uncovered triggered additional financial scrutiny from several business partners, and while nothing illegal was ultimately proven, the investigations exposed enough questionable maneuvering to damage his reputation professionally. Trust matters in real estate development, and suddenly people trusted him less. A few months earlier, Daniel would have recovered easily through charm alone, but arrogance ages poorly. Once others stop benefiting from it, investors' snorts became cautious. 2 pending partnerships quietly dissolved. Invitations slowed. The same social world that once celebrated his confidence began privately describing him as reckless. That's the cruel irony of status-driven communities. They worship confidence right until it becomes inconvenient. As for Vanessa, she disappeared almost immediately after the hearing. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she ended the relationship less than 2 weeks later. Apparently, dating a successful married man felt exciting. Dating snorts a publicly embarrassed middle-aged divorce, a drowning in legal complications did not. I never celebrated that news because, despite everything, I understood. Something Daniel still didn't. Humiliation alone does not transform people. Sometimes it simply exposes them. Sophie improved gradually once the divorce finalized. The tension lifted from our house first, then from her voice, then slowly from her eyes. We moved out of the large family home by mutual agreement during late summer, though not because I needed the money. Honestly, after Daniel left, the place had started feeling like a museum dedicated to emotional exhaustion. Too many rooms built for appearances, too many memory trees carrying invisible cracks. Instead, Sophie and I moved into a smaller lakefront townhouse, nearly 40 minutes away in a quieter community near St. Charles. The home overlooked a narrow stretch of water lined with walking paths and old maple trees, and for the first time in years, our lives became peaceful enough to hear ourselves think. That mattered more than luxury ever did. I rebuilt slowly after that. Not dramatically, not through reinvention fantasies or glamorous revenge transformations. I simply returned to myself. I started consulting part-time again through a financial advisory firm run by a former colleague from Chicago. At first, I worried I'd forgotten too much after years away from the industry. But within weeks, the old instincts returned. Naturally, market analysis, investment structures, long-term planning. The work energized me in ways I hadn't realized I missed. More importantly, it reminded me I still existed outside motherhood and marriage. That realization healed something profound. Around the same time, I also began volunteering through a women's financial literacy nonprofit in DuPage County. Many of the women there weren't wealthy at all. Some were rebuilding after abusive marriages. Others had spent decades depending entirely on spouses who controlled every account, every purchase, every major decision. Their stories broke my heart because I recognized pieces of myself in all of them. Not the financial circumstances, the silence, the slow erosion of confidence, the dangerous habit of shrinking yourself emotionally to preserve peace. One evening after a workshop, a woman in her 60s pulled me aside quietly. I stayed 31 years because I thought needing him financially meant I owed him loyalty, she admitted softly. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. No one earns the right to disrespect you because they pay bills, I said. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized I was speaking to my former self too. Daniel contacted me for the first truly honest conversation about 8 months after the divorce. Not through lawyers, not regarding Sophie directly. He asked if we could meet for coffee. Part of me considered refusing immediately, but another part understood something important. Closure sometimes matters less for the person apologizing than for the person who survived. So, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe near downtown Naperville on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel looked older than I remembered, not dramatically, just diminished somehow. The sharp confidence that once filled every room around him had thinned into something more fragile. For several minutes we discussed Sophie's college plans politely. Then, eventually, silence settled between us. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly and looked down at his coffee. I was awful to you, he said quietly. Not defensive, not performative, just tired. I studied him carefully because for years I had imagined hearing those words. Back when I still wanted justice emotionally, I believed acknowledgement alone would heal everything. It doesn't. Some damage changes shape permanently. I kept thinking success entitled me to things he admitted. Attention, admiration, control. I said nothing. He rubbed his hands together slowly, and when you stopped needing my approval, he gave a hollow laugh. I didn't know who I was anymore. That sentence stayed with me afterward, because beneath all his arrogance, Daniel had built his identity around being necessary. Powerful people sometimes panic when they realize love cannot be maintained through leverage forever. I did love you, he said finally. For a moment I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. I think Daniel truly did love me in the limited way he understood love at the time, but selfishness had hollowed that love into possession. And possession eventually destroys intimacy, because ownership and partnership cannot coexist forever. I know, I told him softly. His eyes lifted slightly, then surprised. I answered kindly. But you loved being admired more. Daniel looked away immediately. Rain tapped softly against the cafe windows, while neither of us spoke. Then, after a long silence, he asked the question I think had haunted him since the courtroom. Why didn't you ever tell me about the money? I almost smiled. Because even now, after everything part of him still believed, the financial secret was the center of the story. It never occurred to me I'd need protection from my husband, I said calmly. That answer hurt him. I could see it. But sometimes truth should hurt, not clearly. When we stood to leave, Daniel hesitated near the cafe entrance. I'm sorry, he said again. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. Not enough to erase what happened. Not enough to rebuild trust, but enough to matter. I nodded once. Then, before walking away, I said something I had spent nearly a year learning myself. You thought money made you powerful? I told him quietly. But real power is never needing to humiliate the people who love you. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stood there silently while I walked into the rain. And strangely enough, I no longer wanted him to suffer, because by then I understood something far more valuable than revenge. The greatest victory is becoming someone your pain failed to destroy. If this story moved you, or reminded you of someone who stayed quiet for far too long, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these resonate because so many people know what it feels like to be underestimated, dismissed, or emotionally diminished by someone they loved. And if you enjoy deep, realistic revenge dramas with emotional truth and meaningful endings, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story.